Right.
We need some text in front of us, Rabbi.
Hold just a second, Alan. Hold on, please. Just 1 second, please. Just. Hello, very much. Right. We are live. Right. Yes, Alan. Sorry, what did you say?
Like, will we need some text in front of us for this share?
Well, we'll be quoting from the letter of Rav Shri Gon. We will be doing Gemara Brachas, Gemara Rosh Hashanah. We will be doing Rabbi Wine and also Rabbi Waxman to get. Nah, don't pick it up.
Got all those, haven't you, Alan?
Are they on your bookshelf?
Yeah, all of them on the bookshelf.
The other half I haven't got.
Yeah, you don't know. I think I've told you this one before. I was doing some research. This was for my master's when I was in Newcastle University. And someone had quoted a book, and I didn't want to just relay over that quote in the article that I was writing. I wanted to actually see it in the original form. I didn't have a copy of it. I didn't think I had a copy of it. Reached out to some friend. Nobody was at the desk. Who was able to help. Called my father. And he said to me, he goes, yes, it's in the lounge next to... Alan remembers exactly the story. So, and then he came back to the phone. He told me one thing. It's in the lounge next to the fireplace, 3 shelves up in your house. I know you didn't borrow it. It's one of the books you got for your bar mitzvah. So, we often have books on our shelves that we don't know exactly where they all are, what they're there. But the one advantage of this lockdown is we've been able to get hold of many more Sephorim. Ralph, did you remember to tell Jonathan to log on because he's not logged on?
I did tell you yesterday about it, yes. So
all right,
I told him yesterday, Ralph, as well, from you.
Okay.
I told Barbara to tell him.
Tell him, right, not a
I
problem.
told him personally, so I know he knows.
Fine.
He enjoyed last week. Maybe he's not able to get on.
He said, "Oh, good. I'm looking forward to that." He said,
He enjoyed it. Said he enjoyed it.
Good. Right. Okay. Fine. You know what? We are going to begin. We've got a 100 years to try and cover. I am going to miss a few bits and pieces out because there are something that we will get to next week as well. Because items, for example, the rise of Christianity. Really, I think we can concentrate on next week, although we may just leave it alone because it is about Jewish history, although it's very much part and parcel of our Jewish history. And one of the events that takes place in this century with Hadrian's Balfour Declaration, just mixing a little bit of a metaphor over there or combining 2 bits of history, is very much impacted by the early Christians, and we will get to them. So, in order to start in the year 100, we actually need to go back 4 years to the year 96, to the Emperor Nerva. Remember last week, I mentioned that Nerva was probably one of the only Roman emperors to die peacefully in his bed, not to be assassinated, normally by a relative, a brother or a son-in-law. They didn't get on very well with one another. So the destruction of the temple, Vespasian and Titus gets assassinated by his brother Domitian. He dies and he gets killed and he gets taken over by Nerva. When Nerva takes over as the emperor in the year 96, just where we finished off last week, the rabbis actually went along a delegation to Rome in order to be able to see the emperor. And they were very successful in their delegation when they went along to Rome, and they managed to convince Nerva to reduce the Jewish tax. There was a tax that had to be paid just because you were Jewish, and this is the definition of a dina de malchusa, a law of the land, which halachically a Jew is allowed to avoid if he can get away with doing it. A law of the land which is done only to impede or to persecute Jews, halachically you do not need to follow. But a law of the land, such as at the moment, the prohibition to have minyanim in public or to have a wedding, whatever it might be, that's not a law to persecute the Jews. in fact, it's for the betterment of everyone, including the Jews. That's Dina de Machus, Dina, the law of the land is a law. You're obligated to follow it. But in the case of when the rabbis went along to Rome in the year 96, we have got Jonathan is just connecting to audio. Just wait a second there. Once he finishes bubbling along there, those 3 lines, we will know that he can now hear us. Hello, Jonathan. I know you can now hear us. Actually, if you want to put your little smiley face, your hands up, so that we know for certain that you are alive there. No, maybe not. No. He might be, he might not be. So this tax in 96 that had been set up earlier on by Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, but they needed a lot of the money because in the year 71 to 80 was when Titus builds the Colosseum and the arch with all the money. The rabbis are able to get this Jewish tax removed. However, Nerva only lives for a couple of years. He then gets taken over by Trajan. So we're right at the year 100, 98 to 100, and Trajan starts terrible persecutions against the Jews. Bear in mind, the temple got destroyed only 30 years previously in the year 70. Straight away, as we learned last week, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai asks for and receives permission from Vespasian to set up the yeshiva in Yavna, Tenli Yavna v'Chachameham, and when he does so, Vespasian thinks he's thrown away a golden opportunity. Why do you want Yavna? But Yavna was what kept Judaism going, and Trajan sees that, and he knows that this is enabling the Jews to really become a powerhouse once again. So he institutes a number of restrictions, persecutions against them. At the beginning of, so 100 years beforehand, in the year roughly around the year 0, according to contemporary historians in the Roman Empire, anybody want to give a guess how many Jews were in the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago? Roughly, give me a number.
10%.
Okay, 10% of what?
10% of the Roman Empire. 10%.
How large was the Roman Empire?
I think 60 million.
Well, in that case, it's more than that. There were 10 million Jews, roughly estimated, in the Roman Empire around that time. Now, of course, when we're dealing with numbers 2,000 years ago, sometimes a little bit of an exaggeration here or there. We know, for example, Josephus, when he says how many Jews came to the temple for Oile Regel on Yom Tov, he picks a number sometimes of over 1 million. And I had a historian professor who said that the way that Josephus figures out this number is he took the market records, which were kept, which they definitely had, of how many sheep were sold for the Korban Pesach, and sort of divided that number or multiplied that number. They reckoned, you know what, if there were 250,000 sheep that were sold, it takes 4 people to eat a sheep, then therefore there must have been 1 million Jews that gone along there. A lot of it is guesstimation, and at times a lot of it is specific exaggeration, because if he wants to, later on when Josephus wants to describe the might of the Roman Empire, how great was the Roman Empire? They managed to destroy the Jews. You want to know how great that achievement was? 1 million Jews turned up to the temple on Passover. If only 10,000 turned up, then Nebuch, the Romans didn't do anything. I'm not saying it was as little as 10,000, but the numbers at times, they might be a little bit exaggerated. And the Gemara itself will give numbers, and Tosfos himself says that sometimes the numbers there are to give you a sense of how large it was. So, Ian, if the Roman Empire was 60 million, it's 10%, so that's 6 million. It's still a large number.
I haven't asked what my source of authority is.
Sorry?
You haven't asked my source of authority.
If you said to me that's authority enough.
No, on the basis I must defer to you because I got it from Hugo Grin.
I thought you were going to tell me a source of authority. Sorry, this is going loud. Listen, it's a good number. It was a large number. Within 3 centuries, 2/3 had gone. We were down to 1/3 that left through persecutions and, unfortunately, through a lot of assimilation and conversion to the new and upcoming religion of Christianity, but more about that in next week. So we've got a large number of Jews going along. During Trajan, the time of Trajan, he stops the Sanhedrin in Yavna. The Sanhedrin in Yavna, after the destruction of the temple set up by Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai, had been there for 10 years. It leaves during the time of Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai. It moves up north to Usha. It then goes back to Yavna for a little bit, but then for the next 18 to 20 or so years, from 100 during the time of Trajan, there is no central ruling of the Sanhedrin. Now, to give an inkling of how important the Sanhedrin is and how important it was right after the destruction of the temple, so we need to go back 30 years to the time of Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai, after the destruction of the temple, the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah tells us of a number of edicts that Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai established. The Gemara in Rosh Hashanah tells us, and don't jump because it changes. So before we say it, you say, oh, well, it's different. Rabbi Yochanan, the Mishna tells us in Tractate Rosh Hashanah, when Yom Tov Rosh Hashanah fell on a Shabbos, they would blow the shofar in the Beis Hamikdash. But in the provinces, so anywhere where there was a group of Jews, and this may have meant also in Alexandria, where they built a temple of sorts, and we'll get to what happens in Alexandria later on when there is part of the revolt, when the Romans are fighting against Mesopotamia and Asia Minor, and they come back. But at this point, there are large areas elsewhere, including a massive quasi-temple in Alexandria. They would not blow the shofar on Shabbos. After the second temple was destroyed, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted that they will blow a shofar wherever there is a Beis Din. And Rabbi Elazar said that he only instituted it in Yavna. They said, no, anywhere where there is a Beis Din. So wherever you had a shul, you were allowed to blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, which was Shabbos. This is in the year 70. 200 or so years later, there's a takana of Rava that because people were carrying it, everybody is obligated to hear the shofar. Not everybody is a expert in the blowing of the shofar, and they may carry it. It's because of that he stopped it. But initially, Rosh Hashanah, which is Shabbos, they blew the shofar. So when I say initially only the Beis Hamikdash. After the destruction of the temple, every shul, 200 or so years later, it stopped. But Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, when the destruction of the temple, said every shul has got with it the sanctity of the temple, that you're allowed to blow the shofar, which is a musical instrument, which you're not allowed to blow on Shabbos, but the sanctity of the shul is going to be in a certain respect similar to that of the Beis Hamikdash. When we say Ein Shivus B'Mikdash, any part of the temple service, or any act which was necessary for the temple service, overrode Shabbos. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said every shul is the same thing, to give the Jewish people that understanding of what it meant to have a shul no matter where we went. I said it lasted for about 200 years, that halacha, but the institute of the shul lasted a lot longer, so much so at the beginning of this lockdown, many people were quoting a slightly edited, but it's based on something that Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch said 200 or so years ago. Shimshon Raphael Hirsch said in the 1800s, if he had the power to shut the shuls for a century, he would grab that power with two hands, because he saw, bearing in mind, this is just before the First World War, the rise of reform, etc., and he sees the dependence on shul life, and he says it's being to the detriment of Judaism, because people think, oh, well, I turn up to shul on Shabbos or Yom Tov or just on Yom Tov or the JFK or whatever it might be. They were forgetting what it means to be Jewish, to bring up their children as Jewish, to have a Yiddish home, kashrus, Shabbos, education. He said, if I could, do not be scared. So everybody's been quoting an extract of it. A friend of mine, originally from Newcastle, has found the original one of that one, written in German. It's not precisely that wording, but the sentiment is shuls, whilst they were brilliant for 1800 years, may, in one extent, encouraged or played a crucial part in sometimes the lack and the downfall of Orthodox Judaism. There's no doubting it that we are in a different era now. And I'm not talking about now, these last 41 days. I'm talking about post the Second World War, where once again, the shul was eminently important, as it was straight after the destruction of the temple. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai does the importance of the shul, blow the shofar on Shabbos, if it's on Rosh Hashanah. Shake the lulav and esrog, Shabbos, which is Rosh Hashanah. But also the entire day of the waving, i.e. the Omer, second day of Pesach, the new harvest is forbidden because you're not allowed to eat from the new grain until the Omer sacrifice is brought. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was saying two things. Number one, your shuls are important, but number two, never give up hope that Mashiach will come today, and therefore you'll be obligated today to bring the Omer sacrifice, and therefore the new crop, the new grain, is not allowed to be eaten. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai establishes those things in the year 70. When we are now 100 years, 30 years later, we've got the shuls. Trajan sees that the deal made by his predecessor Vespasian has backfired, and Jews are really thriving. They are having a real resurgence, and everything is going well. But you've got what is called the second revolt. The first revolt starts in the year 66. Here we have the second revolt. Let's make sure that I get the right page and the right time for the second revolt. We are, so the exact time of it, I've got the exact date of the Jewish revolt, unless I can find it here, sorry. The problem is here, 114. 114 is when we've got the second revolt by the Jews against Trajan. Bearing in mind, Trajan goes along in order to fight Mesopotamia, Israel, and Egypt, and the island of Cyprus as well. Trajan is fighting against the Parthian Empire. We'll get to later on as we have Vologases III and the leaders of the great Mesopotamian. And Rome goes along and Trajan declares victory. By 115, the Parthians refuse to accept the Romans' rule, and they start to fight again. And you've got another war breaking out. Rome fails. Rome fails for the same reason it failed every single time. They were overstretched, and their supply line gets cut off. And years earlier, centuries earlier, 700 years earlier, when you've got the Assyrian Empire destroys the northern kingdom of Israel during the time of the first Beis Hamikdash and exiles the 10 tribes, the 10 lost tribes as we know them, the Assyrians know exactly what to do. When they defeat an area, they take the leaders and they exile them. They bring in the Maccas, the landowners from another area, and they dump them in the newly conquered area. So they're no longer Maccas. The people that are there, they keep the farmers in order to maintain the land, but all of the rabble-rousers and the people that could lead an insurrection are moved all over the place. So even though your supply lines, you can't keep going, you can move on to another area. That's why the Assyrians exiled the 10 tribes. It was classic warfare. The Romans don't really do that. They set up procurators in each area. They want them to be subservient to Rome. And so, many times it works. You have circuses, and you have the gladiators, and you have the games in every single area. They're giving their money back. Sometimes the locals say we don't like that anymore. The Jews never did. The Jews always revolted against the Romans. Here, the Parthians do that in 116, and Trajan gets a blooded nose. And on his way back, when they're withdrawing from into Asia Minor, they're going along, and the Jews also jump up in this revolt, the Jews in Babylonia, and Trajan gets seriously annoyed, and he starts to attack the Jews that are in what's today southern Turkey, North Iraq, and Syria. He leaves behind a ruthless commander by the name of Lucius Quietus, who did not quit, or Quietus, he doesn't quit, and he goes along and he totally destroys the Jewish community. The Jews in Alexandria also get caught up in it, and by the year 117, Alexandria, the Jews of Alexandria, with the great synagogue there, is totally destroyed with the murder of 1 million Jews. The Alexandria Jewish community had 1 million Jews in it. In the time of Trajan, around 117, 120, they are all totally wiped out and it's gone. The Jews of Cyprus, totally eliminated. They're not there. The diaspora Jewish community is practically destroyed. Trajan dies, was killed once again in around the year 120. And Hadrian takes over. Hadrian we all know because of Hadrian's Wall. I spent a couple of years in Newcastle and you can see parts of Hadrian's Wall. When Hadrian takes over to begin with, he thinks, you know what? Bloodshed is not good. And in the year 120, he actually goes back to allow the Jews to do it again. And in the year 122, he delivers what has been called nowadays the first Balfour Declaration. He allows the Jews to rebuild the temple in the year 122. Now, the temple was destroyed in 70. 122 takes us, how many years later? 52 years later. If we have a look at the destruction of the first temple, with the promise that it would only be destroyed for 70 years, it fits in. They started building about 55, 60 years later. And when they finally do fully rebuild it, after the story of Purim, we are pretty much 70 years. Although, I've got to be careful here because it's being recorded, and on the very, very, very minuscule off chance that my history professor from SOAS is ever watching this, I will have to say that according to non-Jewish historical sources, there's no way that the second temple was built in exactly the year 140. You know, the Jews like to say it was built in the year 140, so that you've got exactly 70 years, because we were told 70 years would be in exile. He was adamant that there's no way, and it started being built in 130, there's a dedication in 135. By 140, it was fully up and running, so therefore it fits in the 70 years. But the Jews really think that there's going to be a 70 years, which is why 70 years after the year 70 takes us to what? 70 plus 70 is?
Of course.
Oh, you're on top of your game today, boys. 140. What happens in the year 130, 135 in the run up to that? The Bar Kokhba revolt. Good. So we've got Hadrian. Hadrian allows initially things to happen. But before we do go along to Hadrian, I want to just take a little bit of a step back, because it's important for us to recognize the rabbinic authority that was taking place then and the humility but stringency of the rabbis at that point. After the destruction of the temple, Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai asked, we said, for Yavna, but also for the house of Hillel, the Nossi, the descent which goes along, and that Nossi, the prince of Israel, continues a whole way along until the year 420 with Rabban Gamliel VII. We've got Hillel number 2 in around the year 350, who establishes the calendar that we use now. But straight after the destruction of the temple, you've got Rabban Gamliel of Yavna. And you also have Rabbi Shimon. Some of you will recognize when we're doing the Gemara in Shabbos, 27b and 28, what took place on that day when there'd been an argument between the rabbis as to what the status is of a certain oven, as to whether or not it was to be considered pure, richly pure, or impure. Just a second, let me make sure. You always have to make sure I've got the right wordings. Otherwise, here, not here, no, sorry, forgive me, there we go. We have the student in Yavna, and you've got Rabban Gamliel, and you have Rabbi Yeshua, and they are arguing over what the status is of this oven, as to whether it's richly pure or impure. At the end of it, the rabbis came to a decision and they wanted Rabbi Eliezer to retract. He would not retract, and he was actually eventually put into cherem. He was banned. But even though Rabbi Eliezer was banned, and there was a number of disputes between Rabbi Gamliel, who was a Nasi, and Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania. At the end of the day, they were not able to go what to do, and they rallied around Rabbi Yeshua. They wanted to depose Rabbi Gamliel as the Nasi. This was only 18 months after Rabbi Eliezer had been banned. Why are they banning each other? Halacha. They wanted to make sure that halacha would be very important. And as we'll see when we get to the end, when Rebbe redacts the Mishnah, and the letter I quoted at the beginning of Rav Shiriragon, this letter here, it's very important for us to remember that we've got, if not necessarily confusion, we don't have full clarity. That doesn't mean to say that the rabbis didn't know what they're talking about. What it means to say is that they are arguing. They are arguing l'shem shamayim for the sake of heaven. But there is arguments in the Beis HaMedrash. As we mentioned last week, Hillel and Shammai do not argue. 6 times they have a disagreement. Beis Hillel, Beis Shammai, the study halls of Hillel and Shammai argue hundreds of times. That's after the destruction. Here, after the destruction, we have the argument between Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Gamliel. They do think it's not fair to establish Rabbi Yeshua, so instead, who do they establish? You should all know this. It's not long since you read his name. Not once, but twice.
Well, wasn't Gamliel, was it?
No. Seder night. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Hareani kivem shivin shana. Behold, I'm like 70 years old, and I did not marry until along comes Ben Zoma, or as we call him nowadays, Ben Zuma. That was the first time they had Seder on night with Zoom, because Ben Zuma comes along and tells them about what they're allowed to do. But when Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is established as a Nasi, if you remember on 27b, we started to learn about it. They go along, he says, I need to ask my wife. His wife tells him, why are you getting involved in rabbinic arguments? You don't have the money, you don't have the lineage. He says, what am I supposed to do? They've called for a man. I'm the one here. Overnight, he has 18 rows of white hairs, and he gets established as the Nasi, as the leader of the yeshiva there in Yavna. And on that day, they expanded the study hall. The Gemara tells us there's an argument, there's 400 rows, it was 700 rows, but they established in loads more. And on that day, because so many of the Chachamim, so many of the rabbis were around, they were able to decide on many halachic questions that had been forgotten or become unclear in the previous 30 plus years since the destruction of the temple. Now, the timing of this may be around the year 110 to 120. So you've got between 40 to 50 years after the destruction of the temple, you've had all of the problems of Trajan. So because of the moving of the yeshiva and the rabbis spreading all over the place, halacha has become murky. When they established Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah as a Nasi on that day, everyone comes along. But it's important to note that both Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yeshua sit in the study hall on that day as disciples, and they agree with the halacha. Even though Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is established as a Nasi, they are able to sit there and learn, and they made sure that halacha was established at this point. However, the whole establishment of the Beis Din has already become a weekender, and now we've got a new group of sages. We've got Rabbi Akiva, who we'll all know, Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Yosef HaGalili, he goes up north, Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, Rabbi Eliezer ben Chisma. They go all over the place, but because of this, because they really do grab the bull by the horns, and they say that Halacha can't fall aside. Again, Trajan was annoyed about that. But let us take us back to the time of Hadrian. In the year 120, 122, he sets up the Balfour Declaration, and he gives permission for the Beis Hamikdash, the temple, to be rebuilt. Two groups of people, besides for the non-Jews, complained. One of them were the remnants possibly of the Sadducees. The other one was this new group of Christianity that was coming along. By 120, Christianity is already seen as a separate religion. It's not yet legal. At this point, they're saying being thrown to the lions. Who got thrown to the lions? The Romans would throw Christians to the lions. The Romans were pagans. They didn't like the Christians at all. And at that point, Christianity was moving away from Judaism, but especially Paul, Peter and James very much were Jewish. You had to have a bris milah, you had to keep Shabbos, you had to keep kashrus. Paul is the one that moves it away. When Hadrian gives permission for the temple, the Beis Hamikdash, to be rebuilt, the Jews went along to the small, at that point, quite small Christian sect in Israel and said to them, you don't need a resurrection. We're building the temple ourselves. You don't need to deify anybody. We're rebuilding the temple. You don't need to make your way to Hashem through the body of Yoshki Poshki. We're going to rebuild the temple again. The group of Christians were very annoyed and led a delegation to Hadrian. Hadrian rescinds his permission. So if we want to look at Bar Kokhba, it begins in 122, around that time, after Hadrian gives permission to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash, and then removes it away from them. Once he removes that permission, then Hadrian decides that not only is he not going to allow legal autonomy, but Hadrian did not want to have religious autonomy either. Remember we said at the beginning that when the rabbis had gone to Nineveh in 96 and had been able to rescind the Jewish tax, that signaled at that point a thawing in the relationship, or a warming, in the relationship between Jews and Rome. It goes down during Trajan, it goes back up in the beginning of Hadrian, and then goes back once again to an even worse time. During Trajan, by the way, if you go along to Rome, you can see the ark, which we mentioned last week of Titus. You can also see the same ark and the column from Trajan with the depiction there of the Jews in the same amount of trouble. You know, the physical persecution of the Jews under Trajan was terrible. Then comes along the religious persecution by Hadrian. Once Hadrian allows the rebuilding of the shul, of the Beis Hamikdash, and the rebuilding of the Jewish walls, the Samaritans, the Christians, I said before Sadducees, I meant to say Samaritans. The Samaritans and Christians say no. He ramps up the pressure. However, the Sanhedrin is back in Usha. They've moved around. Usha is further north, near the area of Tiberias, and they move along. Rabbi Akiva establishes the yeshiva, and he sends his disciples out around the whole of north of Israel, from Jerusalem up to the north. The Galil, not the Golan, the Galil is filled with Jewish centers of learning, and Rabbi Akiva is able to really inspire the Jewish community at that point. However, pride comes before the fall, and we have the third rebellion of the Jewish people that is led by Bar Kokhba. Not sure when exactly it began. It could say some say as early as 126. Others say it's not until 137. So there is an argument as to when the Bar Kokhba revolt, the third and last revolt of the Jewish people. We've got the first one in 60, 66 until 70. You've got the second one in 114, 116, mainly by the Jews outside of Israel. And then you've got the third one, the final revolt by the Jews in Israel for 1800 years. From that point on, after the end of the Bar Kokhba revolt until 1948, there is no Jewish autonomy in the land of Israel. It lasts for nearly 1800 years. Hadrian, when he decides he's rescinding his permission to rebuild the temple, also says that the Jews are not allowed to have circumcision, they can't keep Shabbos, they were not allowed to wear tefillin. The other day in the Daf Yomi Shir, we learned the story of the rabbi who was wearing the tefillin and who then gets seen wearing the tefillin. So it's a Gemara in Shabbos, and he goes along and he gets asked, what's in your hand? And he says, they are kanfei yonam, they are the wings of a dove. Here, the man was the name of Elisha Baal Kanafim, Elisha, the owner of the wings. That's from this time over here with Hadrian, when they were not allowed to wear tefillin. If those seem familiar, Shabbos, Bris Milah, Kashrus, they were the same ones done by the Greeks in the time of Hanukkah in the year 130 BCE. So about 200, 250 or so years earlier. And in the same way that the Maccabees revolted then, the Jews revolted now. Hadrian does something else as well, though. He mints coins saying that Judea is free. He made it Judenrein, the city Ilia Capitolina. He was totally Bar Kokhba comes along and he takes these coins that Hadrian minted and he stamps on them, Jerusalem is free. That now Jerusalem, and they re-established a kingdom and he was there for a couple of years. From the rabbinic perspective, they see Bar Kokhba. To begin with, his name was Bar, he gets called afterwards, Bar Kosiva. Bar what? It's Bar Kokhba. And then he goes along to be Bar Kokhba, the son of a star. He was Bar Koziba. He was Bar Koziba. Shimon Bar Koziba is renamed the Bar Kokhba, the son of the star. And Rabbi Akiva throws his weight behind him. And for a few years, Bar Kokhba is able to do it. In contemporary Roman history, they describe how strong he was, that he was able to uproot a tree whilst he's running on horseback, on a bareback horseback, he would charge you along and he would grab the tree and rip it up. Again, whether that's literal, I don't think so. If it is literal, then you would assume it's more of a sapling than a tree. But bear in mind, he was a strong person. He is able to gather together a large group of people. At one point, their armed forces totally outnumbered the Roman forces there, and everything is going well for a while. From the rabbinic perspective, Bar Kokhba then, after 3 years, decides he doesn't need the rabbis, and he starts thinking that he declares himself as Mashiach, he declares himself as the king, and he no longer listens to the rabbinic authority. That was the beginning of his downfall, at least if we're reading it from the rabbinical history. And he goes so far, he executes, as part of a judicial execution, his uncle. It was a famous scholar, Rebbe Lezer Hamodaim. And that was it. At that point, he lost all support from the rabbis and any of their supporters. And he loses a battle for Jerusalem. He has to flee along to Beitar. In Beitar, they locked themselves in. There should have been enough food to keep them going in Beitar to go along. They could have held out against the Romans. You might recognize that thing of being enough food to hold out against Romans from last week, when in Jerusalem had enough food. That time it was the disciples of Shimon HaGalil who came from the north, who burnt the food houses. One of them was Bar Kokhba. So one of them was Rabbi Kiva's father-in-law, Kalba Savua. They burnt down his ones. Here, instead of them burning down the warehouses, a spy from the inside went out, traded, and told the Romans how to get in through the subterranean tunnels to go inside Beitar. They go in Beitar, and they massacre everyone there. According to most calculations, 1 million Jews lost their lives in the Battle of Beitar in 135. That was the end of Jewish autonomy in Israel from the year 135 through to the year 1948. We don't have autonomy ever again. Hadrian, after 135, forbids the Jews to bury their dead, and in fact, he lines them all up as a wall around Beit Har. But one of the farmers said he didn't have to fertilize his fields for an entire generation because of the amount of blood that had soaked into it. 15 years later, once Antoninus Pius comes to the throne, he stops the persecutions that Hadrian has put in place. We're now up to the year around 140 or so. He allows in the year 150 for the bodies to be buried. And when the Jews go along to bury those bodies, they notice a miracle that none of the bodies that have been stacked outside for 15 years, none of them had decomposed, and they were able to bury them, give them a full burial. That is when the fourth bracha of benching after Uvanei, benching used to finish. Uvanei Yerushalayim, bracha Hashem, Beinim Rachma Yerushalayim Amen. That was the end of benching. Hatoiva Meita, the bracha after that bracha was done in around the year 150, when they noticed that the A, they were allowed to bury, but B, that the bodies had not decomposed. During the last bit, and then we need to get on to the compilation of the Mishna, the last bit that happens after the year 135, we still got Hadrian, is the murder of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, we read it on Yom Kippur and on Tisha B'Av, one of the 10 martyrs. On Yom Kippur, when we read the story, it's prefaced with one day that terrible man came along, he fills up a warehouse filled with shoes, he gathered in 10 great rabbis of the generation. He said to them, what's the halacha if a man kidnaps his brother and sells him, i.e. what the brothers did to Joseph, and they give the halacha, they need to be put to death. He says, right, since the time of the brothers, the time of Joseph, there have never been rabbis like you, I'm putting you all to death. And we then read out the list of the 10 martyrs. The problem with that piece within our davening is that the 10 names that are there are not all alive in the same generation. Their deaths, their time of death, their living, some of them don't even overlap at all. Some of them are never alive at the same time. So the preface story is poetic license. It is liturgical flowery. It's nice, but it's not actually what happens. Rabbi Akiva is one of the last to be murdered. He's murdered by Hadrian at the Hippodrome in Caesarea. So we go along to Caesarea and we can see the aqueduct. The aqueduct was built by Herod, and there's also the massive Hippodrome that says, have many of you been to Caesarea? Have you been along to see the Hippodrome in Caesarea? It's I mean, now it's just a great big oval track. I think they recreate it in what's that movie? It's a famous one. The time of the destruction of the time. It's what's the name? When you see and you've got the Jews and the Romans and you've got them on the Hippodrome.
Ben-Hur.
Thank you very much, Ben-Hur. The movie of Ben-Hur, they replay out the Hippodrome. That's the Hippodrome in Caesarea, and in 136, Rabbi Akiva is torn, literally, he's torn to death using metal combs by Hadrian in the Hippodrome in Caesarea. However, because of what Rabbi Akiva does and the students that he establishes, primarily one of them is Rabbi Meir. And we say, Stam Mishna Rabbi Meir, and anonymous Mishnahs like Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Akiva is able to do what Bar Kokhba was not able to do. And he's able to defeat the Roman Empire. Because in much the same way that Hillel, who'd refused to get into an argument with Herod, in the same way that Vespasian had said to, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had said to Vespasian, forget about riches, give me Yavna. Rabbi Akiva does the same thing. He says, I need to establish my students. We know this time of the year during the Omer, we mourn the death of Rabbi Akiva's 24,000 students. What does Rabbi Akiva do after the death of his 24,000 students? He moves down south in Israel and he gathers together around him 5 more students and he starts everything all over again. The students that Rabbi Akiva has, let's make sure we're going to get the 5 students correctly. Can't remember, I've not written them down over here, but Rabbi Meir is Rabbi Akiva's disciples. Let's make them here. Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, we all know Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Shamua. He teaches them Torah and he's able to re-establish. Rabbi Meir Bal Hanes, one of the most famous ones of those. One of his teachers is Rabbi Elisha ben Acher, who we know apostatizes, but they established Judaism the way it is meant to be. After Hadrian, we have Antoninus Pius, and then Marcus Aurelius. In rabbinic sources, there's a little bit of confusion as to who Rabbeinu HaKadosh was friends with, whether it was Antoninus or whether it's Marcus Aurelius. In contemporary sources, it would seem to be that it's Marcus Aurelius. That's why I mentioned last week that we have to make mention of the movie Gladiator and Russell Crowe. One of my favorite scenes there at the in the Gladiator when he gets called in after Marcus Aurelius gets murdered by Commodus, his son. Then Russell Crowe, who's playing the Gladiator, says that he's the he's a loyal follower of the true emperor Marcus Aurelius. And it's at this time Marcus Aurelius is very friendly with Rabbeinu HaKadosh. We must make mention at this point as well, we've also got Targum Onkelos, the translation of the Chumash is done during this time. However, there are those who believe that Onkelos was in the 3rd century. I'm going to leave it alone for the moment because there's a major point over here we have to understand. Hello, Brian Lieberman, you've just joined us. You all right there?
Fine, thank you, Rabbi.
Good, right. You've got the last 10 minutes, but that's not a problem. Just going to give you the last 10 minutes. We're up to the year roughly 180 Common Era.
I'm sorry, I struggled to find you. Sorry.
Don't worry, Bernice, it's fine. You never need to apologize. You've got here, you've got to do some learning. It's not a problem. In Chai Bracha, can you pass me those 2 books over there, please? In the year, so it's got the book stand on the other side over there. What's it? Thank you very much. You got it? There we go. We have got the Jewish community in Karan in Tunisia. It was originally established in the year 670s. Yes, I'm jumping along the whole way, and it's there for about 4 centuries until the Fatimids came along in 969. And at one point in the very beginning of that, we have, it's around the year 775, we have got the Karaites are causing some problems for the rabbis, and they sent along to Rabbi Sherira Gaon, who was the head of the academy, which is going to be established in next week's lesson, the Academy of Surah and Pumbedisa, which lasts for 1,000 years, a yeshiva which lasts for 1,000 years, and they send it along to Rav Sherira Gaon, who is the Rav in between 906 and 1006. So sorry, the letter was sent to them in around the year 1000, asking what is the authority of the oral law of the rabbis coming from the time of the Mishnah. And they asked Rav Sherira Gaon this question. 5 questions are actually asked to begin with, and Rav Sherira writes an entire book with his answer. We're not going to go through the whole book now because it is not that important. But the important thing that they do ask is what gave Rebbe the authority? Bearing in mind, Rebbe is living, he puts it together, and I always say he puts it together, he compiles it. He doesn't write the Mishnah. Oftentimes we say Rebbe authored the 6 tractates of the Mishnah. He does not do that. Rebbe just brings them together, the sayings of the rabbis that had been for the previous hundreds of years. He goes the whole way back to the time of Antignos Ish Socho. When we start off the Mishnah, the ethics of the fathers we did last week, and we say how Moshe Kibel Torah Sinai, Moshe got it from Sinai, gave it to Yeshua, Yeshua to Nevi'im, Nevi'im to the Anshi Knesset Agdola, and they said Antigonus Ichsocho is in the year 260 BCE, which is when the chain of rabbis began from the end of the Men of the Great Assembly after the story of Hanukkah, before the story of Hanukkah, and it continues the whole way along now until 190. So we're talking of over 400 years of rabbinic sayings. For the first 200 years, when you had the Beis Hamikdash, when you had the Sanhedrin sitting in the Lishkas Hagozos, the chamber of the hewn stone, there was a very simple procedure as to what you do if you have a question. And Rav Shri Ragon quotes this, and he quotes it from the Gemara in Yuma. It says, in the name of Rabbi Yossi, originally there were no disputes in Israel. Rather, the Beis Din of 71 members sat in the hall of the hewn stone. So that if you go into the Beis Mikdash, on the right-hand side, there was a room there, the Lishkas Hagozos, where it was half inside the sanctified area of the Beis Mikdash, half outside of it, and on the outside, the Chachamim were able to sit. Plus, you have the two courts of 23 sat, one at the entrance to the Temple Mount, one at the door Temple Courtyard. There were other courts of 23 in Jewish cities. If a question arose, they would consult the local Beis Din. If they had a tradition, very interesting, if they had a tradition, not if they knew the answer, but if they had a tradition of what the answer would be to this question, they would state it. If not, they would go to the Beis Din of the closest city. You might be a little bit larger. Do you know? If they have a tradition, they state it. If not, they then go to the Beis Din at the entrance to the Temple Mount. Do you have a tradition? Yes, good. If not, they continue on to the Beis Din that's not inside until they got to the Beis Din of 71, where a final decision was rendered. So until that time, you went the whole way along and you want to have, is there a tradition? Ian and Alan, you'll appreciate it. Is there precedent in law here? So does the local Beis Din, yes, we've got a tradition. This was what was said. Nowadays, that's what our rabbis are like. They are not law makers. They are law disseminators. This is what we have a tradition of. It might be not exactly this case, but it's analogous to. And that's where you get machlokus nowadays. Is electricity the same as making a fire vis-a-vis Shabbos? That's where we get our machlokus. But back then, do we have a tradition? Is there precedent in law? I don't know, but maybe a larger city with a lot might. I don't know. Let's go to Jerusalem, the Beis Din that sat at the Temple Mount. We don't know. Let's go inside. Until they got to the Sanhedrin, if they didn't know what's said, they would render a decision. They would now give the halacha. But the Gemara continues. When the disciples, but the disciples of Hillel and Shammai increased in number, disputes multiplied in Israel because they're not studied Torah sufficiently. As a result, the Torah became as two Torahs. There are two schools of thought, so much so that after they established the halacha is going to be like Hillel, anybody who doesn't follow Hillel is called derogatorily a shamuti. He follows Shammai. It was quite a derogatory term to be known as a shamuti. And so Rebbe comes along and he collates together. One of his teachers was Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir's teacher was Rabbi Akiva. And so he goes on and says, Rabbi Meir is very clear and he transmits it over without any confusion. Why? Because that's how Rabbi Akiva taught it to him. And the Gemara says that from the time of Moshe and to the time of Rebbe, there hadn't been anyone with the same type of prophecy. According to Rabbi Shri Ragon, he actually sees a parallel between the Ruach HaKodesh, the divine inspiration of Moses, and that of Rebbe. Now, to what extent that's supposed to be taken literally, a matter of conjecture, we'll leave that alone. But according to Rabbi Shri Ragon, and he goes through all of it, what Rebbe does is he takes everything that had been beforehand, because we have a rule that no one says anything that they've not heard from the name of their teacher, and he collates it together. But because you've got so many different yeshivas all over the place, you've got, that's why, as we know, we're learning Daf Yomi, we sometimes say, oh, well, this is Machlekas Tanoim. How can the Amarab, we'll get to it next week, How can they argue? Because actually it goes to a previous argument of the Tanoim. The Tanoim are the rabbis from the time of Antigonus Issocho up to Rebbe. And so we finish today's century with Rebbe compiling the Mishnah, the 6 orders of the Mishnah. He doesn't necessarily compile them in that order. That's done later on. And Rav Shirira says, actually, we learned them in a different order. Within each tractate, Rebbe put them out as the specific order in the tractate, but each individual tractate, put them wherever you want. You can't start saying, oh, because one's before the other, that means something. That was done later on. The 6 orders of the Mishnah, we've got Zeraim, which seeds, it deals with all agriculture. Later on in the times of the Gemara, the only tractate of Gemara, Babylonian Gemara, that deals with Zeraim is Brachos, the first one, because in Bavel, the laws of agriculture didn't apply. In the Jerusalem Talmud, where it does apply, and the Jerusalem Talmud is finished in the 4th century, in the round about the year 330 there or thereabouts. You've got the Jerusalem Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud is about another 6 years later. They have more of it. So Zoroyim is the first order. Moyed is Yom Tovim, Shabbos, Yom Tov. Noshim, women, all about the laws of marriages, divorces, Yevamas. Nezikin, damages. Kodshim, all the laws of sacrifices. And then Taharas, all the laws of purity and impurity. Rebbe compiles all of that together. And we're going to finish today with 2 things that take place, which takes us for next week. Number 1, we've got Rav. Rav is one of the transition generation from Tanoim, the rabbis of the Mishnah, to Amoraim. He goes along to Surah in Babylonia, and he establishes the yeshiva of Surah in the year 200. That yeshiva stays there until the year 1034, there or thereabouts. You have over 800 years of this yeshiva. It's closed twice for a period of 40 and 45 years. But at the same time as he establishes the yeshiva of Surah, Shmuel, his contemporary, establishes the yeshiva of Pumbedisa, and that remains open. It also shuts once, whilst there's always at least one of them open. For 2 periods of 40 years, only one of them. But for 800 years, you've got yeshivas of Surah and Pumbedisa. For sake of clarity, the beginning of the yeshiva of Pumbedisa is called Naharadiyah. So, but we'll learn more about that in next week. So we have establishing the academies that last for 800 years until the end of the time of the Gaonim. Do not please confuse the Vilna Gaon with the Gaonim. The Vilna Gaon is a title that was given later on. He's in the 18th, 19th century, so we'll leave him alone. 18th century, we'll leave him alone. Here is Gaonim in Babylon from the 5th to the 10th century, when the yeshiva that established next week closes finally, and Judaism, the main centers of Judaism, moves to Europe. So that's one point to remember. You've got Rav, go along. The other one is we are now going to be leaving mainly the emperors of Rome. We've gone up until Marcus Aurelius. At this point, at the end of the 2nd century, we've got Commodus, who's killed his father, Marcus Aurelius, who was a little bit of a rascal. Marcus Aurelius was a very nice man. Together with Antoninus Pius, they overturn the restrictions and persecutions of Hadrian, and they allow Rebbe to put together the Mishnah. And we're going to be moving on to the rulers of Babylon from the Parthian Empire. And according to a quick search on Wikipedia, we are going to be looking at Vologases IV, who rules from around the 140 until 190, the son of Mithridates V, but we weren't yet underneath them. And there are a number of fights between them and the Roman Empire, following along from the ones that Trajan had lost earlier, which caused the persecution of the Jews in the year 116. But we're moving away from the influence of Rome. We're going to be coming more under the influence of Babylon, although Rome still does manage to cause a little bit of problems, mainly although their persecutions in next week are going to be persecutions against the Christians. But don't give too much away. We'll be back here again next week as we go from the year 200 to the year 300 in the Common Era. And that takes us to the end of today. I hope you've enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
Square.
Thank you.
Square.
No questions? Oh, you're an easy bunch.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Bernice, next week, we start at 12. So if you've got any trouble connecting, let me know. If you want to follow from the beginning, who knows?
No, I will. Thank you very much. Now that I know, thank you very much.
You're very, very welcome. Have a
God
good day,
bless.
gentlemen. Don't
Thank
forget,
you.
tonight we're at 7:30 here. I know in the original email it said 7 because we were going to be joining in with the chief, but we're back at 7:30 Mincha Mariv with Shiva for Michael's brother as well. All the best.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
You're
Thank
very
you.
welcome. See you then. Bye.